So I think this is going to be a super interesting series, especially as a 2-7 matchup goes. If you look at it on the surface, you think way better basketball team, Grizzlies are going to run away with it. I think it's going to be closer than people think. First of all, I'm picking the Grizzlies. I think they'll win in 5 or 6 games, but I think the games are all going to be very competitive, and I do think it's going to be a much more entertaining series than the outcome would imply. First of all, home team won all 4 games this year. They split the season series 2-2. That's not entirely uncommon for a young team that's athletic. Both of these teams are young and athletic, for them to feed on the home crowd and to play well when they're at home. This series is going to be crazy up and down. These are 2 of the fastest paced teams that we have in the league. The Timberwolves are actually the fastest pace, and the Grizzlies are the 4th fastest pace. So expect it to be up and down, super athletic, high flying, very entertaining. It'll be a fun series to watch. Like I did with the other series, what I'd like to do is split this into 2 sections. So we'll look at it with the Timberwolves on defense, and then we'll look at it with the Grizzlies on defense. So let's start with the Timberwolves on defense. So they were 13th in defensive rating this year, which is okay. When you dive into the numbers, they were okay in paint points allowed. They were 11th in the league, especially when you factor in Karl-Anthony Towns as your backline defender there, who's been better this year than he was in years past, but still not an elite rim protector by any stretch of the imagination. So the credit for that goes to the perimeter players. As I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the Clippers game, the Timberwolves were 6th in drives allowed per game per the NBA.com's tracking data. That data cannot be filtered for pace either with the way that the website is set up. So when you factor in that the Timberwolves play the fastest pace in the NBA, they're probably a top 2 or 3 team in the league weighted for pace in containing ball handlers on the perimeter and limiting dribble drives. You saw that in that Clippers game tonight, making things very, very difficult on Reggie Jackson and turning Paul George into a jump shooter, which is a huge part of why they were able to come back and win that game. That's going to be an interesting dynamic against the Grizzlies, who rely on Ja Morant as a dribble penetrator. Desmond Bane, he's not a great dribble penetrator in terms of isolation possessions. He's more of a slasher, kind of attacking closeouts and things like that. Jaren Jackson Jr. is more of like a mismatch attacker, trying to put his head down and go to the rim. So I think it's going to put a strain on the Grizzlies' defense and their ability to generate rim pressure. This is where it's going to be the test on Ja Morant. I've said many times that Ja Morant is the kind of guy that nobody can keep in front, and we're going to put that to the test in this series against a very, very good dribble contain team. I would imagine you'll see a mix of guys like Patrick Beverley on him and then more long athletes as well to try to change things up. They did a really nice job of turning Ja Morant into a jump shooter in their matchups this year. In matchups specifically with the Timberwolves, Ja Morant was 3 for 20 from 3. Like I said, I expect Ja Morant to eventually be a very good 3-point shooter, but he's in that inconsistent phase of shooting development. Young players always struggle with replicating their success. They tinker with their form too much. It's a big part of why they get inconsistent. Ja Morant's kind of in that phase. So a huge part of this series is going to be, is Ja Morant shooting well at this point in time, or is he shooting poorly? Because I would imagine part of the game plan to try to help contain Ja Morant is going to be going underneath screens and forcing him to be a jump shooter. The biggest weakness of the Timberwolves defense happens to be a thing that the Grizzlies aren't great at. It's kind of a similar dynamic that I was looking at in the Chicago Bulls and the Milwaukee Bucks series. Like, you can't beat Giannis because he's way better than you, but maybe your team has a weakness, or their team has a weakness that your team has a strength, and you can compensate for some of that talent difference. The Milwaukee Bucks give up the most wide open threes in all of basketball, like I've said so many times this year, and the Chicago Bulls are dead last in 3-pointers attempted per game. So the Chicago Bulls aren't going to generate enough threes to capitalize on Milwaukee's greatest weakness. Similar kind of dynamic here. The Timberwolves are not a great 3-point defense. They give up the 4th most wide open threes in basketball, and they give them up to the wrong people. They're 6th in 3-point percentage allowed on those wide open threes. So they're not leaving the right guys open, if that makes sense. But the problem is Memphis is 23rd in 3-pointers attempted per game. So their team doesn't generate a ton of 3-point shots. Again, weighted for pace, that could be even worse. So on the defensive end of the floor for the Timberwolves, I actually think they're going to hold their own. This is going to be a really, really interesting dynamic there. It's the other end of the floor where the Grizzlies are on defense, where I think they have their biggest advantage. So when you look at the Grizzlies defense, it's interesting because they're 6th in defensive rating, but when you kind of dive into it, there's a lot of things that they're pretty average at. They're an average paint defense. They're average allowing dribble drives. They're an average defensive rebounding team, which is an important part of finishing defensive possessions. The key to the Grizzlies defense and the reason why they are so good is they defend the 3-point line well, and they get out in transition. They're 2nd in turnovers forced. and they don't give up a ton of wide open threes. It's a huge part of why their defense is held together despite being average in a bunch of other places on the floor. I think a huge part of this defense is going to be the types of threes that they give up. So, Minnesota leads the league this year in three-pointers attempted and three-pointers made. So Minnesota generates a ton of three-point shots, more than anybody else in the entire league. But Anthony Edwards and D'Angelo Russell are bad pull-up jump shooters. So there are 60 players this year in the entire NBA that have attempted at least 5 pull-up jump shots per game. D'Angelo Russell's only shooting 36% on those pull-up jump shots, which is 45th out of those 60 qualifying players. Anthony Edwards, dead last, 32.5%. So even though they're a great three-point shooting team in their drive and kick game, they are not a good pull-up shooting team with their 2 primary ball handlers. That kind of puts them in a predicament that I think Memphis is going to be able to figure out how to shut them down. First of all, we talked about this earlier with Karl-Anthony Towns. We won't get too much into it further, but Karl-Anthony Towns is at his best when he's operating on the low block. When you crowd him, he's not a great passer and he struggles with all that length and athleticism. You saw the Clippers do that to him last night. I think Memphis will do that to him as well in this game, in this particular matchup. So a lot is going to be put on Anthony Edwards and D'Angelo Russell again. In last night, they made enough shots. D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards made big, pivotal pull-up shots. But for the most part this season, they haven't. And in this particular matchup this season against the Memphis Grizzlies, part of the reason why they went 2-2 is D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards were making jump shots in those games in particular. But that's 4 games out of 82. You're going to play them 7 times in a row now. It'll be interesting to see if they can knock down shots. The key to Minnesota having any chance of winning this series is Anthony Edwards and D'Angelo Russell making jump shots as Memphis packs the paint and goes under screen and rolls and does all those things to try to take away the easy stuff that they can generate, especially with Anthony Edwards in the threat that he is putting his head down and driving to the rim. Like I talked about in the Clippers game, the game turned when Anthony Edwards started putting his head down and going to the rim. But he has a tendency to settle a lot. It's been one of his issues in his young development. Not a criticism. It's typical for young players. It's part of that decision-making thing we were talking about earlier. So a huge part of this series for Minnesota to have any chance will be Anthony Edwards continuing to apply rim pressure. If he does that, it will help them to develop generate those wide open threes. Also, it makes it so that Anthony Edwards gets high quality pull-up jump shots. It's kind of like that James Harden dynamic that I was talking about earlier. That's going to be the interesting dynamic in this series. One of the better three-point defense teams in the league in Memphis going against the team that generates the most three-point shots and three-point makes in the league. This side of the floor is where I think Memphis is going to take control of the series and end up winning. I see this series going 5 or 6 games. I do think Memphis ends up winning it, but I think all the games individually will be competitive and highly entertaining, up and down basketball, athletic, above the rim. Should be a really, really interesting series. All right, guys, that is all I have for today. I appreciate your guys' support as always, and I will see you tomorrow.